let's start.
Okay, thank you very much. My apologies, I only speak English. I feel ignorant in this company. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you to Lorenzo for his warm introduction. Thank you to Rocco for the organisation, and to Bruno for being a great translator. I would like to take Bruno home to translate my departmental meetings. He summarises so succinctly. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is this idea of farm life histories, and I guess oral histories more generally, which is something I've been working on for quite a long time. The presentation here just adds a bit of colour to the written paper, so I thought I should get a picture of a meadow in. So my work has been around hay meadows and their conservation. We talk about being experts in our fields. I think this is the one field I might be an expert in, but not on the ecology, really, more on the social science. So I'm a geographer, and I'm interested in talking to farmers about their practices. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the approach is this farm life history interview approach, which I've documented in a couple of papers. And it started with my PhD research in the early 2000s, speaking to farmers on their farm. And I've now become so old that it's longitudinal research, because I've been revisiting these farmers in the years since then. And that's been interesting to find out how they change their thoughts. So I've included some interview quotes, which I'll let you read. I won't read them out. But the farm life history approach that I've been interested in developing is essentially, I guess, like an ethnographic approach of spending time on farms with farmers and their families and the wider people who work the farm. And that's important, I think, because it gives an insight into the everyday practices, the embodied nature of that, and the diversity of people who might be involved within those practices. And so I started with an interest in hay meadows and their conservation, and then I became interested in the sort of sociology of the family farm, thinking of Gloria's paper that I've read before. That unit and the dynamics of that and the idiosyncrasies of that, I guess. In terms of the geographical location, I'll come back to this slide, but the geographical location, UK, the Peak District of the UK, and those are the study sites that I focused on in the hatchings down at the bottom, just to give you an idea of the location. But I was fascinated to sort of read this document and the parallels in terms of the research we're doing. Very different locations, but similar ideas, I think. So one of the ideas of being on the farm is that you get a sense of the landscape. I guess archaeologists would call this experimental archaeology, where you can understand a little bit about the past by being in the landscape in the present and understanding perhaps why people in the past carried out the practices that they did. I've talked more generally about rural history and oral history, and agricultural history, and I think it gives access to these three interlinked things: practice, knowledge, and power. Practice, knowledge in terms of the knowledge of habitats, the knowledge of habitat change, the knowledge of what's going on, practices in terms of how they've changed over time and some of the rationale for that, and power, I think, in terms of the wider context, in terms of the way people are operating within particular socio-political contexts, I guess. I start with just a couple of brief examples where I think oral history can be very useful, and part of that is in documenting change. One of the problems with hay meadows in the UK is that we just don't know how many have gone, because there's no baseline data. We talk in environmental history about shifting baselines, don't we? But actually, there is no baseline. And the figure that's quoted is the 97% figure at the top, and that's a common discourse now. If you see hear the media talk about this, they say 97% of meadows have been lost. But actually, when you go to the data, it comes from this report in the 1980s. And when you get to the end, they haven't really got any data. They just sort of had a bit of a guess. I don't think you could argue against it, but it's not very accurate in terms of the data that it holds. But I think farmers have some knowledge of this, often unwritten, but verbalised, and can tell us a little bit about it. So one of the examples is that they can locate previously where meadows were. So here's some land that was mown by horses years ago, but since mechanisation, it's not been used as a hay meadow. And there's potential there. We're talking in Gloria's paper about sort of seed banks and that may exist there. And here's potential for that sort of, for oral histories to be utilised in that way, maybe. And then also in terms of retrospect, I think Enrique later's talking about backcasting, and we could sort of see this to some extent within the discussion of what farmers say about their meadows. So there are experiments in the UK and elsewhere to work out what is the impact of fertiliser, what is the impact of cutting date, what is the impact of disturbance. And through someone's diaries, they took me through their diaries and talked about when a meadow had been mown. And even though it was mown very early, Meadow 1 here, it was still floristically really diverse. So during the war, it was mowed ploughed as part of the plough-up campaign, so completely disturbed. I suppose completely ruined, the ecologists would say, in terms of that disturbance. But over time, over that sort of 60, 70-year period, it's regenerated and gone back to being a very important, floristic, diverse meadow. So that history can give us information that our experiments and field trials can't, because the long-term nature of this. It will take years and years to work out what these field trials are doing at the moment. And then just through their observations, so farmers can look at meadows and compare and contrast to those neighbouring meadows, neighbouring farms that have done things differently, that have used different management practices. So this is just an example of dog daisy. And I like Wilson's quote that farmers can perhaps be permanent monitoring plots. They have some knowledge of that history that can help us tell what impact different managements are having. And then moving forward, as I've been doing this work and revisiting these farmers, I've got interested in how they undertake agri-environment schemes, undertake conservation schemes, whether or not they will protect their meadows. And I've been using this idea of good farming, and I'm accompanied by Rob in the room, who's written the book on this, Burton et al. 2021, available from all good bookshops. But this is inspired by the ideas of Bourdieu, and a recognition, which we touched upon, I think, in the earlier papers, and perhaps a theme that runs through the book I've been reading here, that not all decisions are economically rational ones when it comes to farming. There are other sort of social and cultural reasons as to why people behave in the way they do and the practices they undertake. So Bourdieu brings our attention to social and cultural capital in particular, and how that's important to the way farmers may act, the practices they may undertake, and has a specific aspect, I think, related to the agri-environment. So some examples of cultural capital, institutional cultural capital, objectified and embodied, and I think the last two are the ones that have been worked through in relation to farmers and agri-environmental issues. That we often associate objective cultural capital with this high crop yields. The neat rows and Robert Works looked at this in quite good detail about how that sort of landscape becomes the valorised one in this productivist era post-war, in the UK in particular, but I'm sure mirrored in many parts of Europe. And allied to that, the skills that farmers demonstrate in being able to operate this machinery, in being able to create these straight lines, create lots of crop, create lots of production. And in our work we've talked about how our farmers' identities often become closely enmeshed with that, and perhaps become inextricably linked with that productivist ethos, that production-orientated symbols are very central to good farming practice in this period. And so I'm quoting a lot of Rob here, but this is some of the things that he's looked at, how agri-environmental measures, the move towards conserving the landscape particularly, could be culturally unsustainable. That is, it's antithetic to the ideas of what good farming may be seen as in this period. So I'm thinking particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s, when many of these schemes started to be expanded. The idea of more extensive management that would perhaps lead to this, in inverted commas, untidy landscape and look quite different to those neat rows that we saw earlier, can be culturally unsustainable because it's antithetic to how farmers would view what their landscape should look like as an embodiment of that, those productivist practices. And so I won't read the quote here, but it talks about that cultural capital may be lost or gained as people move into this type of practice. And so through the longitudinal approach that I took, I revisited farmers over this 20-plus year period now to find out whether they'd gone into these conservation schemes, as some had, agri-environment schemes in the UK, which I can give more detail on, but it's changed slightly, but I think similar to schemes you have here, where there's prescriptions of what management people want. And what was interesting in that, whilst initially was some reticence, some concern about going into these schemes, relationships and ideas have developed over time. So I was interested in Gloria's presentation where we're talking about sort of expert and lay knowledge to some extent, my terms rather than Gloria's, but that sort of dichotomy. And actually over time it was found that these conservation scientists or conservation officers have become accepted because they've developed their own capital within this place. They come to know what the landscape is like, they come to understand the perspectives of the farmers, and there's a dialogue, there's a productive dialogue between the two where they recognise that farmers may hold some valuable knowledge which will tell us about this conservation. So in the past they referred to scientists, and that could have been production scientists of the 1930s who were encouraging them to take on practices which would produce, and then the conservation scientists who were saying let's move in the opposite direction. And discursively they were treated as one. The scientists keep changing their mind. We stay the same, but they keep changing their mind. When I first interviewed in the early 2000s. But when I've revisited more recently, the people have been what I've called individualised, that they say actually they do know what we're doing, they understand our perspective. So it's about the sociology of this, I guess, the productive relationship between the farmer and the conservationists. And then there's chance, I think, to... These quotes come from the different time periods, so talking about the same land, of how farmers' knowledge has been taken on board within schemes. This is to do with rush pasture, juncus, is that the right term? Essentially pasture land which has rush species, which is often to do with being wet, but really good for ground nesting birds, and particularly in the Peak District, lapwing and curlew. But the farmers said this isn't good to conserve these because the land just gets choked up, was the term he used. Nothing can grow there, nothing else happens. And over time, over the course of doing these interviews, or over the period between the interviews, the agri-environment schemes changed slightly to start mowing some areas of this, and that was to give room for ground nesting birds because they realised that the habitat was too dense. So farmers felt a sense of ownership when they were able to talk about how this fits in with their ideas of good practice, because it shows an active management. For many of the farmers, the extensive management that they were worried about was showing that they didn't care. It didn't show any care for their lands. So this shows, even within this more extensive management, that they do care and there's an active practice. And then important here, and again it relates a little bit to, I think, to what Gloria was saying about different groups. Not all of the farmers understand the detailed ecology and the aims of the conservationists, but by looking at examples nearby, what I've called contextual understandings, they can learn from others who are talking about innovation and diffusion, and I guess the classic model talks about those pioneers, and then people will follow on behind. And I think that's interesting here, that they are necessary not just to emulate, but to show that this will work in your context. Many of the rules that were given, many of the prescriptions are abstracted from other contexts to the Peak District, and therefore didn't make sense to these farmers because their timings were different, it was a slightly different landscape where they came from. But seeing others in the same context, farmers, their neighbours who they trust and who have a level of capital that they can sort of engage with, they're important to them. They can see, as Bourdieu says, these people rich in economic capital have the potential to move in these new directions, and I think others follow as they can see the example that they give. Okay, finally, sort of very briefly, but one of the things here that I think is useful is a recognition that actually conservation and agri-environment schemes can offer a chance to show capital and skill. And I use examples of hay meadows and mowing those and the skill that's needed for that, and also dry stone walls, which are probably a bit specific to the UK and the Peak District. But the reconstruction of these boundary walls is an important part, and again shows a skill and shows active management rather than a passive management. So just to conclude, I think lots of information that farmers can give us about agricultural change, but in conjunction often with other sources that we might use alongside it, detailed knowledge of these practices. And I think the framing of capital gives us a handle, gives us something a framework to understand some of that decision making beyond just the economic. And I think this sort of framing could be useful for all sorts of agricultural innovations. I'm looking at agri-environment schemes in a very specific context, but I think that sort of framing could be useful for our wider discussion today of agroecological transitions. Thank you. I think I'm a bit over my 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Very rich presentation. I have divided my comments into 3 points: on method, on your method, on your argument, and the context. So mixing comments but also questions, because of course also reading your paper raised a lot of questions in my mind. So first of all, the method. On the method, I very much like this farm life history approach, in the sense that it puts together agrarian history, environmental history, and social history, oral history. Also the methodologies of walking interviews, group interviews, which, by the way, doesn't come out of the paper, so I would like to know more about how do you practice group interviews. And also, you mentioned in the paper the caravan camping site and adjacent farmland, and I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on that, which is about context. I was wondering if in this method you have also I've also been practicing what now it's become a little bit fashionable in the environmental studies, environmental humanities, the multi-species ethnography, because I'm really intrigued by this, but I really don't know how can we practice. But it sounds very consistent with what you were describing. I myself have written a little bit on the not multi-species but interspecies relationship between peasant people, not only farmers, but people on the land, and other species, and how they construct their own identity in relation to other species. And I was wondering if that is something that you have encountered in your conversations with the farmers, or if the other species are just out there, something out there that it's not part of their identity and their way they see themselves. So you write that this approach of farm life history can help us in reconstructing the past environments to which much contemporary policy aims to return, as well inform discussions on the likely re-transition toward more sustainable form of landscape management. This, if I understand, it's the core point of your methodology. But I was wondering here, and this is a little bit of a challenge, but not just to you, but to everyone here, also related to what Gloria was talking about, agroecology. I mean, it seems to me that what comes clear to me, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that agroecology here is pretty much like a policy that comes from science, that comes from the conservationists to the farmers. And this sounds like a little bit, I'm using Rancière here, so a little bit of a way of policing what farmers do once again, right? So now, before it was for the sake of productivity, now it's for the sake of sustainability. But I think that this, to me, this looks like part of the problem of why agroecology is difficult to implement. But just a very small part of the problem, because I also think that the biggest part of the problem is that agroecology is not, I mean, organic farming has not died, it has been killed, right? So there's a whole structure of economic structure that goes against it. Anyways, Also, I was thinking on agroecology, the way the FAO defines it. Concurrently, a science, a set of practices, and a social movement. This also came out of Gloria's talk, and she was mentioning as part of, big part of the problem towards the end of her talk, the lack of a strong social movement for agroecology. And I think this is in Europe, because probably in Latin America it's different, right? But in Europe and in Spain, in England, I was wondering what is is there an agroecology movement in the UK? So that agroecology is, I mean, one of the components of agroecology, no? Or is this component completely missing? Because this, I think, is related to what place do farmers have in the agroecological transition, if it is their movement as well, or if it's something that they are policing into, are being policed into. Okay, so the argument is that practices of high capital value, like tidy farming, may often be incompatible with AES, that you write in the paper, is agroecology science?
Agri-environment schemes.
Okay.
Sorry, it's conflated to, yeah.
All right, agri-environment schemes.
Yeah, just
right, so policies.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, okay. So you say that practices of high capital value, like tidy farming, may often be incompatible with agro-environment schemes. And they focus on less intensive farming practices and may render such schemes culturally unsustainable. However, we might be seeing a transition toward more environmentally focused identities via a process of individualizing, which, if I report correctly, is knowledge exchanges between farmers and conservation scientists, through which farmers' experiential understandings and historical observations may be uploaded into agro-environment schemes, and also give farmers a greater sense of ownership of the conservation management. And this whole is based on the observation that farmers' vital knowledge, which you call embodied cultural capital, and site-specific understandings of nature, etc., can offer insights into the likely success of current management prescriptions. So my question is related to this argument, this core argument. What is the place of market constraints and incentives in all this? I mean, the whole food regime and food system goes into a different direction, right? So, how do you factor in, let's say, the economic rationality into all this, no? Because I think this is aspect of the problem that needs to be factored in. Otherwise, we run the risk of doing like the environmental studies or environmental also movements have done for a long time, like asking consumers, individuals, to do the ecological revolution, whereas individuals are really powerless, no? Facing the way the whole economic system is run and structured. So, yeah, I understand this is not part of what you were writing about, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this. Sorry, it's a bit challenging, but of course this is a question not just for you, but for the whole symposium. It's something that I would like to see discussed. A little bit on the context, if you can tell us a little bit more on the land tenure structure of this area that you're studying, what kind of cultures, if they're monocultures, polycultures, Also about the forms of practices of labor, and if there's migrant labor, if there is a high intensity of pesticide use. Yeah, I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Stefania. That's fantastic. So much there to think about. It's good having someone who's so insightful to look through what you've written, so thank you for that. I'll go through in order of what you talked about and try not to take too long, but you mentioned the sort of methods and approach. The group interviews sort of came around by accident. So usually when you're approaching farms in the UK, so I used various methods to access farms, and one of which was directories of farms that are listed, and that tended at that time to be men, farm men listed as the principal holder. And so I went to interview them, and often in farmhouses, and farm women would get involved, and they often knew a lot, sometimes a lot more than the men, and so quite often more than the men, but didn't always want to be interviewed. So that's where this group interview approach came from, almost like a focus group type of approach in farm households, on farmland. And the walking interviews as well came out as a result of that, because I wanted to get out and speak to farm workers, again, those who'd managed the land, those who were out there. So that's where the group interview approach came from, to try and bring in all of those points. And also the importance of that in terms of intergenerationality. I think family farms is important and been discussed before, and many of these decisions are multi-generational, sometimes 2, 3, in one case 4 generations on the same farm, each making these decisions, sometimes over long time horizons, you know, so decisions now will impact the generation in 2 generations time. So that's where that came from, a sort of almost by accident, but then developed into a method that I thought was really useful to get multiple perspectives. Because even when I wanted to speak to women, and I did get to speak to some women individually on their own, because I then got interested in gender and farm practices and all of those things. And sometimes they didn't want to be interviewed, but they joined the interview and said a lot, but didn't want to be interviewed, but they were in the room and present. I did write one paper which interviewed farmers and sons together, and I was very interested in the sort of narrative devices and the discursive strategies they used, how they corrected one another, but how they used similar family stories and family narratives that got replayed over time. So that's where the group interviews came from. You mentioned the caravan and camping. That's just a flag to a project I'm now working on in this area for English Nature, our sort of conservation body in the UK. They're currently interested in what role can caravan sites and camping sites play in nature conservation. They were looking, and this is a bit of context really, if I just show the map. If I show the map, I chose the different areas, this relates to your latter point, around context, some of which are in the southwest peak, which is sort of gritstone, high altitude, running up to 1,500 feet above sea level, and then into the Derbyshire Dales, which is limestone plateau land, which is some of the best dairying land in the UK, so very intense dairying land. And I've just finished a project where we've been looking at calcareous grasslands on the sites of special scientific interest. And it's a unique habitat because it's on the slopes of the valleys of the Derbyshire Dales, but when you get onto the plateau, it's really intensive dairyland. And so there's that sort of challenge between the two, which is quite difficult. So much of the plateau land has been intensified, and the ecological diversity reduced. It's swaths of green lush grass that are used often for dairying. And so they're looking at what corridors we might produce. So they've looked at verges, roadside verges, but still the farmers go out and mow the verges because it looks tidy. But they said, oh, that'd be really good for species, for butterflies. So now they've said, well, what about caravan sites? There's a lot of tourism in this area. It's a popular tourist sort of honeypot. And so they've looked at this and said, could those camping and caravan sites be used? I haven't done the research yet, but I think the answer will be no, because they mow them and nice and tidy and keep them short for the caravanners. But they're asking the question, these aren't used for intensive management, they're used for another practice, but could they be valuable? That's why I mentioned that one. I really like the multi-species thing. Sadly, meadows can't talk, so that makes it very difficult. But I think these, I guess the sort of relational, I suppose a sort of actor network, so slightly old-fashioned term, but that sort of relational agency of these meadows and habitats are quite important. I think there's quite a sort of pride that people take in talking about their land, in talking about the improvement that they've made to their land. And I think that's one of the interesting things in this productive period in the post-war. Much of this land in the Southwest Peak was reclaimed moorland, so heather, Matrilis and sort of moorland, which was actually reclaimed during the war by prisoners of war, I think Italian prisoners of war, reclaimed, lime added to bring down the pH of the soil, and these are reclaimed farmland. And the language says everything, doesn't it, in terms of reclaimed. And many of these farmers very proudly talk of the narratives of how they've intensified that land over time. And so that gives a long family history, often connected to a number of generations, and a sense of family pride. And so reversing some of that narrative, I think, is quite challenging. Interestingly, in relation to species specifically, there's a great intertwining of sort of biographical things within there. So when I was trying to date, so many people say, well, oral history is unreliable in terms of what people can remember, but when it becomes intertwined with biographical details, when a child was born, when they bought new land, when a family member died, when someone retired, that biographical element to that is important. Going on to approach, yes, policing, we probably have moved. I should have said at the start that when I started this, and to some extent still now, these schemes are still voluntary, so farmers don't have to undertake them. And I chose different areas because there was some more often taken. So in the area in the Southwest Peak, which is less productive land, there's probably a greater acceptance of these because they've provided a valuable income and so related to your last point around the economics of this. Yeah, many of those farms wouldn't survive without the money from the agri-environment schemes. It's paying a lot of money to that. Less so in these more productive areas. So even in this small geographical region, the context, the geology, it simply comes down to geology. Limestone, brickstone, and more productive soils, less productive soils, so even within that. And there's a willingness, I think, to engage, and perhaps less so. But I think we're at a tipping point. I think we always say this in our own time, don't we? We're at a tipping point. But I think now we have, dare I say it, post-Brexit policy, which has increased some of the payments that are being received, for example, from the calcareous grasslands, and so those economics are becoming more important. So there's a policing in a general sense of what I think it's called the Code of Good Agricultural Practice, that they can't do anything too environmentally damaging, but the proactive managements are still more voluntary. So that sort of relates, if we were to draw a diagram relating to your last point of the economics, I think it's an economic outer shell with a sort of social and cultural inner shell that might be a useful way of framing that, so the two work in dialogue. And as commodity prices change, at the minute in the UK, beef and lamb prices are really high, and so that's fighting in opposition with some of the conservation, because people are, well, we can grow more grass and produce more. So it's a really interesting one within that. Yes, and is it a social movement? So one of the things I was interested in speaking to the farmers after, so I've spoken to them again in recent years, and tried to trace the difference in their narratives across the interviews. Do they take on the language of conservation and biodiversity? And I think they do. They certainly have adopted the language. They talk in terms of species diversity. They sometimes talk about individual species. They've taken on the terms of the ecologists and the conservation scientists. Do I think that means they've genuinely moved in their ethos from production to post-production or to environmental management? I'm not quite so sure. I think if someone said, you can plough it all up and reseed it and get money to do that, they might well do that. I don't think it's necessarily changed a whole sort of sort of ethos. But I think there are these productive bits around it, sorry, productive is the wrong term in this context, but there are useful and valuable bits around the edge where there's a win-win. So wall building, hay meadows in some cases, that they can still produce from it. So if we take the Russia's example I was talking about, where was it? There. This has actually been useful for conservation, but also for the farmers, because their lambs grew bigger. They had more grass in between these patches, so their lambs grew bigger, so it was a win-win situation. There was habitat there for ground nesting birds alongside producing some their lambs as well. So I think there are productive things around the edges. I'm not sure I've covered all of your points, but I think I've got most of them there.
Yes, you have.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So, any questions, comments?
We have 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Yes, David.
Thank you.
Hello, David. I can see you.
Presentation, and I would like to ask you about this farm life history interviews. If you have collected some information about the process, the past of this past transition from kind of organic farming to an industrialized model in this process of green revolution that also Gloria was talking about. If you have collected information about that, in terms of knowing how that is perceived from now, because when you are thinking about the past, you are also thinking from the current situation. So if there is some critical perspectives or not, well, in terms of knowing, talking about this new process of transition, if we can learn a bit from the past in terms of how to develop, from policies, these processes of transition. And I have another little thing to ask you, and sorry for the question, but related to the Brexit. So it have
Please don't mention Brexit.
if that has changed a bit this relation between agriculture and environmental policies, and well, if you could explain a bit about that.
Yeah.
Shall we gather? Yes, one more question.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. You use a concept as an idea, as a possibility, moving back. But I think that, I don't know in England, but I think that in Europe, in continental Europe, it's like a countercultural idea for farmers, for sons of farmers and grandsons of farmers. Then, what about this? It is an idea to mobilize farmers, or, in your opinion, or not? Because I think it's the way is learn from the past to change the future, but moving back is.
I'll deal with that first before I forget everything, but I think that's a really important one in relation to this. When the schemes first came out, they referred to traditional hay meadow management, and it wasn't anything to do with my work, but they eventually dropped that because it did signify regression, backwardness, and so they dropped mention of the traditional now. And I think the traditional was intended to show that in living memory you've undertaken these practices. But as you rightly say, that then gives the connotation that we want you to go back to before, when you feel like you've progressed from that. So they've changed, and I think that's useful. And there's, in the UK, and I'm sure here as well, there's the terms like sustainable intensification and that sort of thing, which is almost a marriage of these terms, isn't it? But I think you're right in terms of the general narrative. The regression can be a negative and seen, it's overwriting their achievements, etc. And so I think the suggestion for this, that they could even remove the mention of hay, because these farmers don't really make hay, it's all silage now in terms of what's taken from this. It just needs to be cut, it needs to be turned. So if you outline what the ecologists would want, it's actually a brand new practice, it's a reinvented tradition to some extent. And I think that is more productive. I know Rob in his works talked about payment by results and things like that, and they're potentially more productive ways of moving forward, but I agree entirely with that, Lorenzo. Going back to David's point, one of that relates to, so it was about tradition, and there was a second point, wasn't there? What was your second, you had a second question?
About if the new policies after Brexit has changed.
Oh yeah, you mentioned Brexit. That's why I immediately tried to forget it.
It's okay, you're in a safe environment here.
Yeah. So what value has Brexit had to farmers in the UK? Absolutely nothing, as far as I can see. I think there's been just an extension of EU policy to a large extent, but potentially with more investment in terms of they've taken some bold moves for certain habitats to increase the payments that they're given within these schemes. But I think that probably reflects the European situation generally. I don't think that's bespoke to the UK, but those two things have coincided. In reality, the post-Brexit policy for agriculture is a bit of a mess, really, because they wanted to do something more deep-rooted in terms of public payment for public goods, essentially. So they framed it in this ecosystem services type of model, but then have realised, particularly in some of the communities where I'm working, that these communities are so heavily reliant on these historical payments that you would lose communities and lose not just industry, you'd lose the sort of wider communities within that. So we're still not 100% clear now what the new policy has been. They had ELMS, it was called, and they had a group of us. Interestingly, social science were brought onto this. DEFRA, UK's government organisation, brought a group of social scientists together and asked our thoughts and opinions on this. But the implementation of that has been really, really slow. One of the key tenets they're trying to bring in is, and I think this relates very closely to your work, David, this idea of collaborative working at the landscape level. We've got these individual schemes which are having patches of success, but we're not looking at the whole landscape. So they're investing in facilitation funds which facilitate the integrated working between farmers. I've written a paper on this, and actually what I've found, I think, is that historically there's been an individualising of farming through this period. So in relation to the first point of your question, there's been an individualising of farms so that we had a thing called the single farm payment, which says everything. It's just about one farm. So the cooperative working that we had in the immediate post-war period, where people would work together, share machinery and things like that, has been eroded over time. And so there's not, taking up Lorenzo's point, there's not that sort of cooperative tradition that they see in other parts. I've seen in Rob's case in Norway, etc., and in the Netherlands in particular. We don't have quite that same level of cooperative working, certainly in England, perhaps more so in Scotland, but we don't have that cooperative history. So that's a real challenge, I think, for this. The project started as an interest in silage making, so the conservation of silage in airtight rather than making hay. And that was a really low, related to your first question, was a really slow adoption in the Peak District. And in part that was because of technology, but in large part it was just what people were used to. That it was a tradition that carried on. And there's a lovely quote somewhere, and it draws the analogy between people using washing machines and doing their washing by hand. And they said the washing by hand went on a lot longer than it should have done logically. And haymaking was a similar process in this polo, particularly given the climate, which it seems is quite similar to here, quite a bit of rain. And so there's lessons there, I think, in terms of it's the pattern of what other people in that region were doing and the sort of collective knowledge and set of practices. So Stefania asked about whether there were migrant workers, and not so much really in this context. It's family farms predominantly. I think it's 80+% of UK farms are family farms, multi-generational. So whilst there were back in deep history, and here's a sort of limitation of oral history, it doesn't go perhaps as far back as you were suggesting. So as you suggested in your question, should I say. So when I picked this up, many of the farmers could remember the wartime period, but that arguably was the start of this productivist phase. So the interwar period would have been a really interesting time to look at and to have those histories. Rob can probably touch more on this with his work on this sort of farm diaries, etc. So there is some information there. It's just that the oral history doesn't quite get that far back. So pretty much I've been focusing on shades of productivity, I think is best to describe it. But it's a great question.
Well, thank you very much, Mark,
much.
and thanks everybody for the questions. I think we need to move.
Take a coffee.
Exactly. Move to the coffee break. So thanks everybody.
Thank you for your kind questions and for engaging.